the development of rockets, rocket operations and space operations, we face a complete novel problem never experienced before by man, the state of weightlessness. Two questions are of importance to us. First, the occurrence of weightlessness, and second, human tolerance to weightlessness.
Hubertus Strughold was one of the most influential of the many German scientists to work for the American military after the war. He was instrumental in putting the first Americans on the moon. Professor Strughold was an aviation doctor. He studied the medical effects of flight. We went to Washington to find out more about his US career. But for some baffling reason, neither the USAF nor the Pentagon would help us. All we were permitted to do was to film the outside of the building. It was while we were doing this that a fax from Washington arrived at our London office. We had to stop filming, or else. Professor Strughold was off limits 14 years after his death. What could it possibly be? Was it something he did when he worked in Nazi Germany? Had this man tricked his way into the heart of the American military establishment? Hubertus Strughold developed his talents for survival during the Second World War, when Nazi Germany was leading the world in aviation. This plane, the Me-163, featured an invention that solved the aerodynamic difficulties associated with nearing the speed of sound: swept wings. In October 1941, the test pilot Heini Dittmar took it into the skies above Peenemünde West Airfield and became the fastest man in the world. He nudged the sound barrier, flying at over 1,000 kilometers an hour at Mach 0.84. This historic event, which was kept secret at the time, turned out to be as much a turning point for Strughold's subject of aviation medicine as it was for engineering. The Me-163 had such a high performance that merely flying it threatened to kill or disable its pilots. Rocket-powered, the plane climbed steeply, up to 10 kilometers in less than 3 minutes. Pilots needed to eat a special non-flatulent diet to prevent air expanding painfully in their bellies. Teeth with faulty fillings became shrapnel. But it was the effects of extreme altitude which were the most terrifying. Kurt Schiebele flew the Me-163 in action during the war.
Certainly, we felt the pressure. It was as if your chest was expanding, but that was probably just imagination. You had to breathe really deeply, and so, by and large, we coped very well with it. It was also partly due to the fact that we were young. We were all between the ages of 20 and 25. None of us was older than that, and at that age, you can withstand a great deal, really.
Und da hält man doch schon sehr viel aus.
To find out what they could withstand, the Luftwaffe was already doing high-altitude experiments on pilots. Here, some of them perform a simple mental exercise while they breathe rarefied air. When altitude sickness kicks in, their writing should become illegible. Some of the doctors felt that while new aeroplane technology was pushing the envelope, experiments on volunteers like these tended to stop disappointingly short of the brink. Besides, it was 1941. Germany was at war. Pilots were badly needed at the front. But what about the inmates of a concentration camp? It seems it was a junior SS doctor by the name of Sigmund Rascher who first suggested that aviation experiments could be conducted on human guinea pigs at Dachau.
Rascher was a captain in the SS. He had been taking some courses in aviation medicine, and it was his idea, apparently, to have the experiments conducted in the concentration camps.
There's an alternative theory, that the responsibility was not Rascher's, but lay somewhere here at Luftwaffe headquarters in the Air Ministry building in Berlin.
So I find it unlikely that this rather unimaginative, as far as we can tell, and average SS doctor, Rascher, would have had the wherewithal to put this fairly complicated project together all by himself, because it involved not only the ideas and the technique, but also getting the equipment, securing the individuals who could be subjects, creating an operation at Dachau, which was not always an efficiently run institution.
One thing everybody agrees is that somewhere here, in these offices, sometime in 1941, it was decided to attach Luftwaffe medical researchers to Sigmund Rascher's concentration camp idea, so the results would be scientifically respectable.
Once it was decided that these experiments would be done, there was a cooperation between the Luftwaffe and the SS. And the Institute for Aviation in Berlin put an assistant to Rascher to work with him on these experiments. This assistant was Hans Romberg. He was an aviation scientist, very ambitious young scientist. He wanted to get credentials, he wanted to get things on his record. So he had plans to publish, and he saw that as one of his opportunities in Dachau to make a mark for himself.
There was a third doctor involved, Professor Siegfried Ruff. He was to supervise the experiments at a distance from his institute in Berlin.
A lot of elite scientists knew about these experiments. They may not have known the exact details, what was happening on the ground in Dachau, in that hut. But they knew, and they sanctioned the experiments, hoping that some information would come out of these experiments which would be useful both for their own research, for their own career, for their own department, but also for Germany's war effort as a whole.
Professor Strughold was the top man in aviation medicine in Germany. It was he who'd founded the subject as a young man. Did he know what was going on? Most probably yes, but not officially. He ran his own institute, which was administratively separate from Ruff's. Ruff, though, was a close friend, and Strughold's own scientific interests lay directly in the areas Ruff and Romberg and the SS man Rascher were to investigate. They aimed first to study the extremes of what happens to the human body at altitudes of up to 21 kilometers, when the blood begins to boil in the veins of unpressurized pilots. And they wanted to simulate what happened to pilots when pressurized planes were blown apart in combat, explosive decompression. How much time did the pilot have before he blacked out? Should he open his parachute right away? Or free fall and gamble on regaining consciousness further down? To find out all this, Rascher and Romberg needed a low-pressure chamber, like this one in use today in Poland. It's a familiar item in the secretive world of military aviation. A metal room, rather like a grounded submarine. These pilots are about to be subjected to the conditions that prevail high in the Earth's atmosphere. The chamber is sealed up, and the pressure of the air inside is then altered according to plan. So far as the pilots are concerned, the effect is the same as though they had gone up in an aeroplane. Professor Ruff in Berlin arranged for a mobile low-pressure chamber like this one, to be taken to Dachau concentration camp and installed there next to a hut serving as a prisoner hospital.
Now, this is a reconstructed barrack, which looked at about barrack number 5, where Sigmund Rascher did his so-called medical experiments. In fact, barrack number 5 doesn't exist any longer. This barrack was built in the 60s by the former prisoners who wanted to show the people what it looked like where they had to stay.
The prisoners in Dachau had not committed crimes. They were there because they had opposed the Nazi regime. Now they were to be human guinea pigs. This is a series of frames from a film, now lost, which Sigmund Rascher shot of one of his experiments. They show a prisoner being subjected to a simulated high-altitude parachute drop. In a grim piece of artistic license, his dead body is shown hanging in a parachute harness. And later on, his brain is exposed in a post-mortem.
Prisoners who had lost consciousness had their chests opened while they were still alive. The doctors would measure how long their hearts would continue beating. And if their heart stopped, how many times they restarted. This they observed, and they wrote reports on it for the SS. These experiments were barbaric.
What they were looking for, of course, was to see at what point, among other things, one would get air emboli in one's blood vessels, and how that would be associated with nausea, loss of consciousness, blacking out, inability to operate equipment. And that information could have been obtained without going as far as they went in many cases. It seems that they began to take an interest not only in that sort of physiological question, but also in the question of what people look like, what kinds of noises they make, what kinds of positions they put themselves into, how they claw at their hair, at their eyes, at their scalps, in an effort to relieve the pressure in their ears.
Embarrassingly for aviation medicine, the experiments were central to the subject. As a result, the Dachau material has a peculiar habit of cropping up in strange places. In a book Strughold later wrote, advocating the colonization of Mars, for example, in the middle of talking about the exploration of the planet, he appears to be describing one of Dr. Rascher's wartime experiments.
If the crew of a plane should be suddenly exposed to the outside air at 52,000 feet by a leak in the pressurized cabin, they would find themselves totally without a fresh supply of oxygen. Unless additional protection were afforded by pressure suits, they would have to fall back on the small oxygen reserves in their blood and tissues. These would last about 15 seconds. After that, they would lose consciousness and the power to save themselves.
Up to 100 experimental subjects lost their lives in the course of the high-altitude research. The legacy of the experiments lives on, for it was in Nazi Germany that the first planes flew at the heights and speeds that have become commonplace today. German aviation doctors were the first to become aware of the safety issues in aeroplanes of this performance.
Welcome on board our LOT Polish Airlines 767 Boeing aircraft.
So it's no accident that the cabin crew's perennial demonstration of oxygen masks, explosive decompression and life jackets covers the same topics as the aviation medical experiments at Dachau. By chance, they even follow roughly the same order. When the altitude studies were over, Dr. Rascher moved on to investigate survival at sea. During the Battle of Britain, scores of shot-up German pilots came down in the sea. By the time air-sea rescue units could come to their help, many were dying or already dead. The Luftwaffe wanted something done about it. This was nearly to be the downfall of Professor Strughold, even though he himself took no part in the experiments, which began in 1942 at Dachau concentration camp.
They were looking for ways how to improve the air-sea rescue system, just whether they wanted to improve the clothing, for example. They wanted to see when they would rescue their pilots from the cold water, whether one could actually find ways of rewarming these people quicker, and different methods and different ideas were floating around at the time.
In Dachau, SS Dr. Rascher had a water tank installed in hut number 5, in which prisoners could be immersed for as long as was required. He intended to solve a long-standing problem in the physiology of cold.
Well, just prior to the war, in the medical literature, there was quite a controversy going on about how you should rewarm people who were cold. Some people said they should be rapidly rewarmed, and then in another journal it said, no, you shouldn't rapidly rewarm them, you should slowly rewarm them. And there were case studies proving each side of the argument. So there was nobody quite knew what to do. Put your mouthpiece in then, please, John. You comfortable? Okay, stand by. We're going to lift you now.
Cold water experiments are still done today. In this one, conducted at the University of Portsmouth, this experimental subject has given his consent and can call the whole thing off at any time.
Well, when they first enter the water, it's incredibly painful. I'm talking about cold water now, very cold water, particularly water around 5, well, anything below 10 degrees centigrade is very cold, and it gets particularly painful below 5. Stinging, burning pain, which then triggers a series of responses in the body, the most common of which are rapid, uncontrollable breathing. Well done. Well done, John. That's good. That's good, John. That's it. We'll ease off now in a minute. Excellent. Well done, John. That will ease off now in a minute. Their heart rate shoots up and their blood pressure shoots up. So those responses will have an adverse effect on a person's survivability in the water.
Dann bin ich nachsitzen, da habe ich bis hier Wasser gehabt.
So I sat down, and the water reached up to here.
Und der Walter, der Oberpflegewalter Neff.
And then I saw the chief medical orderly arrive with 2 buckets of ice, which he poured into the water.
Gekommen und hat in diese Wasser reinschieben. Verstehst du mir?
And then he put his hand on my head and forced me down under the water, so I had to lie like this. And in this moment I experienced terrible pain. In my knees, in my head was throbbing. How long did this go on? I can't say. All I know is that I lost consciousness. Finished.
Schluss. Spätens kann ich nicht sagen genau, ob das ist 3 Tage, 5 Tage oder ganze Woche.
Later, I can't say exactly whether it was 3 days, 5 days, or a week later, I came to, feeling terrible pain all over my body, but especially in my head. It felt as though a turbo engine was running in my head.
und Schmerzen.
And the pain, even worse. I couldn't hear a thing. I'd become deaf. My eyes were moving to and fro as if they were following a football match. One eye was moving to the right and the other to the left.
Jersey was lucky to survive a system in which his only function was to act as experimental material to test rival scientific theories.
At the time of the freezing experiments, there were two theories about how to thaw somebody out. An airman who had been shot down in the North Sea, or a child who'd fallen into the ice. The prevalent theory was that you have to do gradual warming, something like the notion that if you defrost a piece of meat too quickly, you'll ruin the tissue, you'll ruin the meat irreversibly. But people were dying. It was the success rate for that kind of treatment was very, very poor. So the alternative theory was that perhaps people should be rapidly warmed. And that theory was tested by Rascher in various ways, including through the use of the body heat of other persons surrounding the victim.
Okay, John, we'll be taking you out now. Are you nearly ready, Claire?
Yeah.
Okay, stand by. 3, 2, 1, now. Up you come again, John. You just relax. Don't do anything. We'll do all the work here to get you out.
Take the mouthpiece out so you can...
Yeah.
So what do you think of us now?
So shivering quite a bit, yes. Stay cold?
Yeah.
And the conclusion they came to was that the best thing to do was to put him into a hot bath, which was right for their particular set of circumstances. It worked.
Okay, you're free now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Off you go into the water.
Get your shoulders underneath.
Lie down. Is that better?
Much better.
Stop shivering almost straight away, haven't you?
It's striking that after the war, the Navy's Air-Sea Rescue Manual adopted, once they found out about the German experiments, they adopted the rapid warming technique, and I believe the manual changed in 1947. What's striking about this is that there's been a long debate in medical circles about the value of any of the medical experiments in the concentration camps, and the general conclusion is that the presumption is that it was all bad science, it was all junk, and you really couldn't learn anything from it. Well, as a matter of fact, something was learned from the freezing experiments, and it was incorporated into our own military doctrine very shortly after the war.
That the Dachau cold experiments were of scientific value was probably down to Professor Holzlerner, an expert from Kiel who supervised Dr. Rascher. What was not legitimate about them, and didn't happen when the same experiments were done in other countries, were the murders.
Dr. Rascher conducted two kinds of freezing experiments. One was in iced water. He left the inmate in the iced water for about 3 hours. The other was the so-called dry cold experiment, where they left the inmate outside in cold weather, below freezing weather, for up to 13 hours and without any clothes. Both of those experiments resulted in many deaths of the subjects.
Even so, Rascher and co. never completely solved the problem of reviving cold people. Even when hot baths were used, some cold victims still died of heart attacks. Had the Hut 5 doctors but known it, the reason lay in the way that people like these rescued airmen were being pulled out of the water. It was only long after the war that the puzzle left by Dr. Rascher was solved, and today's highly successful air-sea rescue procedure invented by the Royal Navy's Frank Golden.
Working with some air-sea rescue squadrons and talking to people who worked with air-sea rescue squadrons, it was apparent that some people were dying during rescue and shortly after rescue. And some of these deaths were not being caused by drowning. Most of these post-immersion deaths are caused by drowning, but some, not all are. And this actually led me back to read the Dachau paper. In fact, I read it for the first time then. And I was rather intrigued as to what actually is the best way of rewarming people. And we did a number of experiments in the Navy, looking at what happened to people after they were taken out of cold water.
It seems that what prevented Dr. Rascher from putting the final touches to his theory of hypothermia was his disregard for human life. Here a prisoner is getting out of the water. Dr. Rascher failed to notice that this puts the heart of a weakened person under immense and perhaps fatal stress.
So, in your remedy, what's different?
You help the load on the heart by putting the person in a horizontal position as quickly as you can after you get him out of the cold water. That reduces the strain and the workload on the heart as a pump and gives the body a chance to recover.
The most disconcerting thing about Dr. Rascher is that his legacy is still with us. Many of the principles of cold water physiology that are used today in air-sea rescue came from Dachau's Hut 5. And even though Rascher himself didn't uncover the whole story, rescued people are still being rewarmed in very hot baths.
I've obviously thought long and hard about this. You're supposed to, if it's unethical science, you're not supposed to use the information. I think in this particular case that there were a number of people who unfortunately died producing this information. We could sweep it under the carpet and forget all about it. But by using it, at least I think it's acting as a memorial to those people.
The Luftwaffe's Dachau research moved on to other areas. But did senior people here at headquarters and elsewhere know what had been going on? They were about to find out in a conference.
It happened in Nuremberg in October 1942 after both the high altitude and the cold water experiments had been completed. Reports had been written. And it was a major conference. More than 90 German scientists participated in this conference. It took place in Nuremberg in one of the major hotels there. In fact, the hotels where Hitler usually stayed during his party rallies. And they gathered there to hear the latest research results which German aviation scientists had produced over the last year. And one of the keynote lectures was given by Holzlerner, not by the scientists who actually conducted the research. So it was done by the person supervising the experiments. And in this talk, it became quite clear that people had died in those experiments. It was not disguised in any way. So everyone in that room who was sitting there, and Strughold and Benzinger, they were all there, and they heard this talk. They even responded to that talk. All those people there in that room knew that in those experiments, which were conducted in Dachau, people had died. So that was not... In 1942, in October 1942, people who had died in experiments in Dachau, it wasn't a secret at all anymore in the German scientific elite.
A transcript of the Cold Conference has survived. The list of delegates contains 95 names. It's a shocking fact that over 20 of these doctors went on to work in the US military and space programs. Among them was Professor Strughold. He was the leading scientist at the conference. If he'd wanted to, could Strughold have stopped what was going on?
It was possible to find reasons to stop experimentation. For example, Strughold was distinguished enough and knowledgeable enough and respected enough so that he could have simply said, well, we've learned all we can learn.
In the transcript of the Cold Water Conference, in Strughold's summing up, he is recorded as saying this:
With regard to the experimental scientific research, but also for the orientation of the Sea Distress Service, it is of interest to know what temperatures are to be counted on in the oceans concerned during the various seasons.
Lawyers have interpreted this as saying, so far so good, but we need to do more of the same sort of experiments.
I get an impression that he's not interested in the people behind these experiments. They don't figure on his scale of issues you have to consider. They're just material, whether they are rats or whether these are these experimental subjects. He's interested only in how can we further our research.
No film exists of the conference. Here, Professor Strughold winds up a different conference 16 years later in Texas. Did he wind up the 1942 Nuremberg conference in the same upbeat tone as this?
Great contributions have been made by the papers presented at this meeting, which have provided an up-to-date information for the following review about the so-called state of the art in space medicine and its related field, astrobiology.
The end of the war saw the liberation of the concentration camps, Dachau among them. For the liberators, it was a shock to discover the extent of the Nazi atrocities. For the former concentration camp prisoners, there were the near impossible tasks of dealing with the bitterness they felt and of trying to lead normal lives afterwards.
Ce vêtement, c'est l'uniforme de prisonnier de Bagnard.
This is the prisoner's uniform of my husband, Arthur Orlo, from when he was in Dachau concentration camp. At the end of the war, at the time of the liberation of the camps, my husband took it off and put it in a cupboard.
Et depuis lors, mon mari a ressorti son uniforme et l'a mis dans son armoire. Et tous les matins, quand il va prendre son costume...
Every morning, he touches his uniform. He's trying to recover his vitality from it. He's trying to get his fighting spirit back.
Il vient chercher sa force de combativité.
Madame Orlo's husband, Arthur, was imprisoned in Dachau for being a socialist. He was experimented on by Dr. Rascher.
Mais nous n'étions pas des hommes normaux. Nous n'existions pas.
We weren't normal men. We didn't exist on a human level. We were guinea pigs at the disposal of Dr. Rascher, who was carrying out these experiments on behalf of the Army, the Air Force, or any other division. We were objects to be used. We were not men to be regarded as deserving of the respect due to any normal human being.
Avec le respect que l'on doit tout être humain normalement constitué.
Experiments were conducted at the Buchan Farm.
23 doctors, a figure determined by the number of available seats in the dock, were indicted at a special trial at Nuremberg in 1947. Some of the Dachau doctors were not there. Dr. Holzlerner had committed suicide, and the SS had rubbed out Dr. Rascher in the last weeks of the war. Ruff and Romberg's lawyers used Rascher as a fall guy, blaming him for the murders. Ruff and Romberg were acquitted. But another, much sounder legal point threatened the very validity of the trial. Had the Allies done unethical experiments themselves?
June 1946, Life magazine published a 6-page photo spread about malaria experiments that were taking place using 800 federal prisoners in Georgia, New Jersey, and Illinois. The prisons had actually delayed beginning the experiments so that the Life magazine photographers could get there to take pictures of the prisoners. Having malaria-carrying mosquitoes placed in glass vases over their stomachs so they could bite them. Why a malaria experiment in June 1945 in the United States? Well, we were getting ready to invade the home islands of Japan, presumably, in order to end the war. And infectious disease like malaria, yellow fever, sexually transmitted diseases take out more men than bullets. That incident came back to haunt the prosecutors of the Nazi doctors and bureaucrats because it was used in evidence by the defense lawyers for the Nazi doctors to show that prisoners in this case and in other cases they could document had been used in questionable experiments for decades, not only in the United States but elsewhere. And the argument was that there were also no good rules internationally for doing human experiments, that there were not internationally recognized standards or conventions.
Although the judges rejected any comparison between the American experiments and the German ones, they recognized there was a problem, and as a result, the Nuremberg Code on Human Experiments came into being. Among other things, human subjects had to give consent and were not to be exposed to injury or death. The sentences at the end of the trial were a warning that from then on, experiments involving human beings had to be carried out according to the new code.
Many high-ranking doctors were given the death sentence. There were, for example, 12 defendants charged in the freezing experiments, and 4 were found guilty. And of those 4, 2 were hanged, and the other 2 received life sentences. And in the high-altitude experiments, 7 were charged, and 2 of the defendants were found guilty, Rudolf Brandt and Sievers, and both of those defendants were hanged.
While some doctors were being tried at Nuremberg, others, like Strughold, were being vetted for export to the USA. In the end, hundreds of German scientists were to become American citizens, working in military research establishments all over the States. Along with the aviation doctors went a priceless gift, their wartime research, presented in book form by Professor Strughold, in which concentration camp results had been prettied up and presented alongside respectable research.
German science was the preeminent scientific establishment in the world up to 1941, 1942. The infrastructure was lost, but the minds were still there. So while on the one hand a statement needed to be made, it was felt, about science gone wrong, in particular medicine gone wrong, another group was very concerned about the competition with our allies and with what appeared to some even then to be a coming conflict with the Soviets.
Strughold and many of his fellow German doctors ended up in Texas at the School of Aviation Medicine in San Antonio.
What do you think, Dr. Gradewald, are the best methods to produce the state of weightlessness within the atmosphere?
There are 2 possibilities that seem to be practical. One is...
Although they sounded rather unconvincing as Americans, they fitted in well. And Strughold in particular quickly became one of America's preeminent aviation doctors. Aviation medicine once more moved ahead. The first post-war experiments repeated wartime studies, some of which had been done at Dachau, like this explosive decompression. Here, a pilot in a fighter plane demonstrates weightlessness. Strughold presided over these advances in the role of leader and inspirer. And his greatest inspiration was the belief that aviation medicine, and in particular the low-pressure chamber, was nothing less than a springboard into space.
In the low-pressure chambers and climatic chambers that aviation medicine has built and operated in the last 20 years, we can produce artificially almost any degree of atmospheric pressure or temperature encountered in planetary environments in our solar system. It would take only minor modifications and adjustments to construct a Mars chamber, reproducing very nearly the exact environmental conditions on that planet, or indeed any planet, from Mercury to Pluto.
To Struckhold's analytical mind, spaceflight amounted to keeping a man alive in a sealed box, which is what some of his colleagues are doing here at the School of Aviation Medicine in Texas. The experiments made the Apollo moon program possible, and Struckhold became America's leading space doctor. But not before he was once again implicated, in a very familiar, hands-off way, in unethical human experiments. In the early 1950s, in the dawning era of nuclear weapons, the USAF was looking for ways to protect its pilots from being blinded by the flashes of atomic explosions. The research program later came to the notice of a government inquiry.
What we discovered in the course of our research as a member of the advisory committee is that during the early 1950s, there were a series of 2 or 3, maybe 4 tests in which the purpose of the test was to determine what the impact on the human eye would be as a result of the atom bomb flash.
Animal experiments had established what a nuclear flash could do to the eyes of rabbits and monkeys. The next stage was to use human subjects. The School of Aviation Medicine, where Struckhold was the chief scientist, was called in to do the experiments. They happened during nuclear tests in the Nevada desert, with the names Buster Jangle and Tumbler Snapper.
The Department of Defense went forward with the test by asking a group of 12 individuals to enter a darkened trailer, don hoods. Half the observers wore eye protective goggles, half did not, observed the flash, and then documented the results. And what was determined in our committee report is that over the course of these tests, at least 2 individuals who were part of this experiment did suffer flash blindness or flash blindness injury, retinal burning.
A secret military memorandum written at the time established that the Nuremberg Code had been contravened. How?
Well, there were 2 ways. First of all, there may have been a violation in that the observers, those subject to the testing, were not in any way asked for consent, asked for permission to do this, were in no way advised as to the dangers and risks. There's at least a possibility of that. We conclude in the report it is more likely that they were asked consent. They were advised of the risks, but the paper trail is very, very unclear. In any event, whether there was consent given, how knowing that consent was, how fully explained were the facts of the flash blindness experimentation, calls into question, at least, the Nuremberg principle of using human beings who are uninformed or not fully informed as test subjects.
After the accident, the flash blindness tests were stopped. It's claimed the 2 blinded men later recovered their sight. Struckhold and a colleague wrote a scientific paper on the results, in which they distanced themselves entirely from the accident. Almost nothing else about what happened has ever come to light. Here, in 1958, Airman Farrell is being helped out of a small sealed metal room after 7 days inside. Camera-shy, Hubertus Strughold, the man who masterminded it all, shelters behind Senator Lyndon Johnson, only darting out of the shadows to congratulate the human guinea pig. Strughold's dream came true. Monitored every step of the way by space doctors, men traveled to the moon in a metal box, climbed out and wandered about in pressure suits, climbed back into the box again, and returned safely. In the 80s, Strughold was both being showered with honors and at the same time being investigated for his Nazi wartime past by officials from the Department of Justice. Eli Rosenbaum was one of them.
It's always easiest to prove a case against the hands-on criminals, the people who physically perpetrated the crime. And it's always more challenging to prove complicity the higher up one goes in an enterprise. The challenge in the Strughold case was proving that any of the people who actually perpetrated these crimes were within his supervisory ambit. I don't think that was ever established. But again, in appraising Strughold's complicity in misconduct, in crimes, I don't think that's necessary. What he did at the Cold Conference as the Dean of Aviation Medicine, at a conference that shocked people by the disclosures of these experiments, is bad enough. It's immoral.
Whether this man was a criminal or merely a fallible human being like the rest of us, what is undeniable is both that he is a link between the Nazi Holocaust and the modern world of aerospace, and also that whatever precisely it was that he did do, he got away with it.
We like to think of history as a moral tale, and a moral tale that can be told differently by different historians. But there are some facts at the heart of any historical characterization of any period. The fact that America got to the moon first, that our space program beat the Soviet space program, is an undeniable one. And it is also undeniable that at the heart of the greatest propaganda victory, perhaps, in history, the single greatest achievement of American democracy, perhaps, in the 20th century, at the heart of that accomplishment is this blackness of the association with, the undeniable association with the medical experiments in the concentration camps.
This is the BBC Home Service. Here is the news. At 8 o'clock this morning, His Majesty the King agreed to surrender to Germany. In return, no more British cities will be attacked with atomic bombs.
Fear that Hitler might have a nuclear weapon terrified British and American leaders. After all, Germany was the greatest scientific nation in the world. It had discovered nuclear science. So why didn't it happen? After 1945, a remarkable explanation emerged. The German nuclear scientists had sabotaged their own bomb. As one of them said,
"History will record that the peaceful development of uranium was made in Germany under Hitler, whereas the English and the Americans developed this ghastly weapon of war."
Can this really be true? Did Nazi scientists actually have more moral courage than those in America and Britain? At the end of World War II, an American task force called the Alsos mission advanced with Allied troops into Germany. They were hunting for Germany's secret nuclear bomb factory. Its leader was the American physicist Samuel Gaudsmit. The trail ended here, Haigerloch, a picturesque village in southern Germany. Haigerloch's church sat on top of a cliff. Beneath it, the soldiers found Germany's secret laboratory. The Allies had spent $2 billion, employed 180,000 people, and worked night and day for 2 years, all because of what they feared they might find here. And this was it, a cave the size of a wine cellar, a pathetic attempt at a nuclear reactor that no one had ever got to work. And even if they had, it would have been impossible to have built a bomb with it.
It was an enormous surprise to discover that this was as far as the German project had gotten. It was the motivating reason behind the entire Allied effort. It was the reason that the Los Alamos physicists worked 7 days a week, worked all late hours into the night, the fear that the Germans might any day, any hour, find some way to do it even more efficiently than the Americans and surprise the West with an atomic bomb.
What had gone wrong? It's one of the great mysteries of World War II. Germany led the world in science, and in Heisenberg had the outstanding physicist of his generation. He knew more about the atom than any other scientist. If anyone could build a bomb, it would be him. Heisenberg had already turned science on its head. In 1925, suffering from a bad bout of hay fever, he had been sent to the barren island of Helgoland in the North Sea to recover. Whilst there, he had made the calculation that had changed the world.
Hat immer wieder gesagt, dass es ein sehr schöner Moment war.
He always said it had been a very beautiful moment. He told me that the idea had come to him during the night and that he went outside and climbed up a cliff to see the sunrise. I suppose nowadays we would say he was high from this revelation.
With all the confidence of youth, Heisenberg brushed aside 300 years of physics and pioneered an entirely new way of thinking: quantum mechanics. He was 24 years old.
By any count, Heisenberg has got to be one of the greatest physicists of all time. Because I think that the break between what had gone before and the Heisenberg conception of quantum mechanics was one of the greatest ever in the history of science.
But the complexities of this young man made it doubtful whether he would ever fit in with the new masters of Germany. Werner Heisenberg had been born in 1901 in Bavaria. Wealth and privilege came easily to the Heisenbergs. Coming second did not.
He's extremely competitive with his brother. We know he and his brother were violently competitive, and he just couldn't stand the offense to his intellectual dignity if he didn't have it right.
Bavaria and Beethoven were part of a romantic dream of Germany that propelled the young Heisenberg into the youth movement and Lederhosen.
Diese Jugendbewegung war eine sehr revolutionäre Bewegung.
This youth movement was really a revolutionary one. They refused to wear their suits and put on leather shorts instead. This was not considered respectable at the time. And they would go skinny dipping and spend the nights playing music and singing around the campfires. None of this was respectable middle-class behavior, but it was very romantic, and it was extremely important to him.
Heisenberg's university professors soon realized that they had found an extraordinary talent.
This young man was a phenomenon, and immediately everybody knew that they had on their hands somebody who was going to make the new physics.
The 1920s was the golden age of physics. The science was young, international, and open. Physicists were one big family, in each other's homes and universities, crisscrossing Europe, corresponding and collaborating, meeting and arguing.
It was a wonderful time, and I came into physics just at the right time in 1926. Heisenberg had done quantum mechanics, and now we saw the world open to explain all phenomena which had been discovered for the last 50 years.
Nothing captured the spirit of the time better than the annual gathering of young physicists in Copenhagen. Presiding over them was Niels Bohr, the father figure of world physics. Heisenberg was the crown prince. For 2 years, he worked in Copenhagen as Bohr's assistant and surrogate son. But Germany was the centre, the imperial capital of culture and science, where every ambitious student in the world hoped to go. German was the international language of science, and Heisenberg represented all the values of this pre-Nazi Germany: civilized, intelligent, morally upright.
He was one of the best models of good German. He himself said, "I embrace the Prussian virtues, which are modesty in living, being reliable, being punctual, all the good things." And he regarded himself as a Kulturträger, that is, a carrier of culture.
Heisenberg lived for culture and science, but politics disgusted him.
Hat immer gesagt, dass eigentlich von den Zwängen und
He always said that he wanted to be free of the ties and injustices of politics, and this was one of the reasons why he chose physics and science. He hoped that he would be able to carry out research without having to get involved in lies and dirty diplomatic dealings.
Aushandlungen involviert zu werden.
Heisenberg returned from Copenhagen to Germany in 1928 to become its youngest professor, home to a country and a university in turmoil.
In the late 20s, the Nazis were getting stronger all the time, and there were demonstrations in Göttingen as elsewhere. Many of the students became Nazis and joined the party and so on. The professoriate was divided. Some became out-and-out Nazis.
In 1933, Hitler took power and proclaimed a Reich that would last 1,000 years. Heisenberg, meanwhile, was making his own journey to Stockholm to receive the Nobel Prize for Physics, little realizing that Hitler was about to take control of German science for his own ends. Among the books burned by Nazis in front of the university library in Berlin in 1933 was Albert Einstein's theory of relativity, because the author was Jewish. The book burning symbolized the beginning of Germany's scientific isolation. In 1933, Hans Bethe, also a Jew, was teaching at the University of Tübingen. He was about to lecture on an important new discovery by the English scientist James Chadwick.
Many students appeared in my lectures with a Nazi emblem. At that time, Chadwick discovered the neutron, and I volunteered to give a lecture in the physics department about this most important discovery. Then I was told that the students would make trouble if I did that. And I was told to cancel that lecture. It was their loss.
The most scientifically advanced nation in the world had been taken over by a gang of thugs. One of the first laws of the Nazis was the so-called Law for the Restoration of the Professional Civil Service. All government employees with one or more Jewish relative had to be sacked. Teachers, doctors, university professors were all civil servants.
In 4 Monaten haben wir 1,2 Millionen beseitigt.
Nothing shows this more dramatically than a photograph taken in 1930. Here is Heisenberg with his most gifted colleagues. In 1933, 4 of them left Germany because they were Jewish. Even Heisenberg, a non-Jew, was regarded with suspicion because physics was tarred with the brush of Einstein.
Es war für ihn, glaube ich, eine schwierige Zeit. Er war sehr junger Professor.
It was a very difficult time for him. He was a very young professor in Leipzig, the youngest one there. And he saw how his lectures were less and less well attended because he wasn't conformist enough. He continued to teach Einstein's physics and always mentioned Einstein's name.
By 1936, all students had to attend military training. Teachers and lecturers were sent to so-called summer camps, during which they were taught how they must educate the new German elite.
Die Studenten mussten eine militärische Ausbildung.
All students had to attend these courses, and if they didn't, they would not receive their diplomas or their certificates.
Die Studenten in Leipzig, ich würde sagen, waren
I would say 90% of students in Leipzig University were in Nazi military organizations. 10% were fanatical National Socialists.
Vielleicht, ich würde sagen, 10% fanatische Nationalsozialisten.
And all our studies and our research became more and more militaristic. For instance, you didn't calculate any longer the parabola of an object, but now you calculated the trajectory of a cannon.
And now the guns were trained on Heisenberg. In 1937, he was accused of teaching Jewish physics, as opposed to Aryan physics. The SS weekly, The Black Corps, attacked him as a white Jew.
People like Heisenberg are all representatives of Judaism in Germany's spiritual life, who must be eliminated just as the Jews themselves.
The bullies were circling, prodding and probing. The SS even spuriously accused Heisenberg of being homosexual.
Himmler hat Heisenberg auch in die Prinz-Albrecht-Straße.
Himmler ordered Heisenberg to the Prinz-Albrecht-Straße, which at the time was the headquarters of the Nazi terror machine. And there he waited for hours, without Himmler seeing him. Himmler was in the office next door, asking all the time, is he still sitting there? Is this Heisenberg still sitting there? For hours, you have to imagine. Here is the Nobel Prize winner sitting there and waiting in the Prince Albrecht Street, waiting and only wanting to hear from Himmler that the attacks on him would stop. He wasn't admitted. Heisenberg had to go back home without having achieved anything.
All we know is that he was very shaken when he returned home from these interrogations. While he was waiting there to be questioned, he had heard other people being interrogated. He had heard the cries and the beating.
Heisenberg snapped.
He used his family connections. The family knew the Himmlers, and so in a one-year-long negotiation, he got from Himmler a letter in which Himmler says, you will not be attacked again. But on the other hand, when you teach, do not mention names that are supposed to be forbidden. Make a dissociation between the work and the people who invented it. And he stuck with that.
Heisenberg had made an accommodation with the Nazis. He would go on teaching physics, but without mentioning the Jew, Einstein.
When it came to speaking up for Jews, he got so worried. It was like a cat with its paws being burnt. He pulls back its old diplomacy, subtlety. He will not commit himself. And of course he could have done, might have had a bit of a fright, but that was his nature. He was somewhat timid because he believed in the need for obedience and patriotism.
Then came a discovery that meant Heisenberg could no longer hide. In Berlin, in late 1938, the scientist Otto Hahn succeeded in splitting in two the atoms of this stuff, the metal uranium, a process known as fission. Physicists around the world immediately realized that fission released an enormous amount of energy, enough perhaps to create a weapon more devastating than anything the world had ever known. This awesome new discovery dominated every conversation at a physics conference in America in the summer of 1939. The world was on the edge of war, and it would be the last time that Heisenberg could speak freely with his friends. They urged him to stay in America. They knew that if he returned to Germany, he would be asked to build an atom bomb for Hitler.
You know, he talked something about physics, and then the conversation in the afternoon began to turn to more political matters. Did he really want to go back, and wasn't it better to stay in America? And he said, well, no, he couldn't do that. He made it quite clear he was a German. He belonged in Germany. And the war might be destructive, so he wanted to be there to help whatever came of it. We tried to point out that it was a bad regime, and so, but it was hard to do that to a man who had already got his mind made up.
So Heisenberg came home. But would he be able to stay true to his values of pure science? Could he be a good patriot without giving Hitler the bomb? In September 1939, as Germans tasted the excitement of war, Werner Heisenberg began work as chief scientist on the Nazi bomb. He threw himself into the project. His authority was totally unquestioned.
It was a kind of honor to be given, and since he had been under scrutiny before, it was one indication that he was getting back into full graces.
The decisions he was about to take would mean the difference between winning and losing the war. In 1939, this is what he and all the other scientists knew about building a bomb. A uranium atom is like a mousetrap on the verge of springing. When struck by a tiny subatomic particle called a neutron, represented here by a cork, it splits violently. As it splits, the atom fires off 2 of its neutrons. Those 2 hit 2 more atoms and release 4 neutrons. They hit 4 more atoms and release 8 neutrons, and so on. Have enough mousetraps and you can trigger an exponential frenzy called a chain reaction, and all in a split second. But this experiment depended on a trick, the plastic cover. Without it, the first few corks would have flown off into empty space, and the chain reaction would never have got going. If we hadn't had this cover, we would have needed hundreds of square feet of mousetraps. Likewise with uranium, we would need a large amount of it, a critical mass. And so far, no one had calculated how much this was. But in 1940, Heisenberg was the man with the answers. He was building a reactor to create this chain reaction. The plan was for it to become unstable and explode. The contrast between Heisenberg's urgency and the West's lethargy could not have been more acute. In vain, the great physicist Albert Einstein, now in America, tried to warn the American president how close Germany was to an atomic bomb. The reason for the American indifference was that they knew that an atom bomb would only work with a very rare form of uranium, U-235. But much less than 1% of the uranium that's dug out of the ground is U-235. And up till now, no one had managed to separate even a speck of it. Since the critical mass was thought to be in the order of tons, an atom bomb seemed in the realms of fantasy. Then came a shock. Remember this picture? Rudolf Peierls was one of Heisenberg's Jewish students whom the Nazis had forced to leave Germany. Travelling to England, he'd met up with another Jewish émigré, Otto Frisch. Both had been offered temporary jobs at Birmingham University. But since Peierls was an enemy alien, he wasn't allowed to work on sensitive projects like radar. Instead, he and Frisch explored the fantasy world of the atom bomb. And in 1940, in a small office in Birmingham University, Frisch and Peierls made an amazing discovery: that the critical mass of U-235 needed for a bomb was only a kilo, a fraction of any previous estimate.
Frisch says in his memoirs that when he and Peierls calculated this tiny critical radius, this critical mass of less than a kilogram, they suddenly stopped and looked at each other, dumbfounded at the new possibility that had just opened before their eyes.
A bomb was possible after all. But if they had made this calculation, so must Heisenberg, their teacher.
We assumed that because when Heisenberg was here in the summer of '39, he talked a lot about fission, so we assumed for certain that they had a project on uranium chain reaction and then on an atomic bomb.
Leipzig University. Where now the rubbish is put out was where in 1941 Heisenberg was building his reactor to produce a chain reaction. It was at this point that he made an extraordinary decision. The road to a bomb lay open before him, he said, and he was so alarmed by this prospect that he sought the advice of his colleague Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker. Together, they decided to visit their old mentor Niels Bohr in Nazi-occupied Copenhagen. Bohr carried enormous influence with scientists worldwide.
I already discussed it with Heisenberg, and we had the common idea that it would be good to prepare a talk between Heisenberg and Bohr on the question whether physicists all over the world might be able to agree not to make the bomb, or at least not to hurry it during the war.
According to Heisenberg, that's what he said to Bohr during an evening walk in a Copenhagen park in the autumn of 1941. It is one of the most famous conversations in the history of science. A scientist risking his life, denying his country the means to win the war for moral reasons.
He was afraid of this possibility to build a bomb, that he had the idea that via Bohr one can make a league of anti-bomb physicists worldwide, so that this bomb and this discovery would never go to the bad end.
The story goes on that after trying his best to convince Bohr of his good intentions and failing, Heisenberg returned home and did all he could to sabotage the German bomb. And that's how the story might have stayed, but for one crucial piece of evidence. Niels Bohr wrote a letter about what happened at that meeting. It has remained secret until now, but one man has read it.
Niels Bohr has written a letter, which I have seen, was shown to me by the family, and which strongly disagrees with the interpretation that Heisenberg gave to that meeting later.
Heisenberg tried to persuade Bohr to accept the German domination of Denmark, to collaborate with the German embassy, and Bohr wanted nothing of it. And Heisenberg tried to persuade Bohr to be friendly to the Germans.
Was Heisenberg a good German, trying to prevent Nazi nuclear Armageddon? Or was he actually working for the Nazis, putting pressure on old friends?
For me, it is unimaginable that my father could have lived a lie for his entire life, even amongst his most intimate friends. It is utterly ridiculous to believe that my father would have fabricated a lie about his own life. He simply wasn't like that.
One man's word against another. If that's all we had to go on, then we might reasonably give the benefit of the doubt to Heisenberg. After all, we know that he didn't build a bomb. But what he did next seems to contradict his story of the scientist who put morality before country. Here, at the end of 1941, in a building now a theatre school, Werner Heisenberg lectured an audience of top Nazi party and military officials on the possibility of a bomb. This was followed by a detailed report.
The report runs to about 130-odd pages typewritten. It's got a patent is listed for a bomb, which I take to be an exploding reactor bomb, not a true nuclear weapon. It would use enriched uranium-235 with a moderator, such as graphite, and somehow or other lose its stability, its thermal equilibrium, and then just explode and create a very nasty mess.
Far from sabotaging his bomb, Heisenberg seemed to be surging ahead. But the battle was about to be joined. The discovery by Frisch and Piles that only a small amount of U-235 was needed to build a bomb had galvanized the Americans. A team of scientists was assembled. The biggest industrial project in the history of the world began. Ironically, its leaders were the very Jewish physicists that the Nazis had kicked out of Germany a few years earlier. The race was on.
The fact that we assumed that there was a German project was the main motivation for us to work on the uranium reactions. It was decisive. We were afraid of a German atomic bomb. We had to have it first.
Nazi Germany had now reached its zenith. There was the belief that within a year the war would be over. All that was needed was the knockout blow. That was the challenge for Albert Speer, Hitler's newly appointed armaments minister. Speer began taking a look at all the secret weapons projects, bombs, rockets, anything that looked likely to deliver the killer punch. At the beginning of 1942, he was intrigued to hear that Germany's physicists were on the track of building a weapon that will annihilate whole cities. Speer asked to meet Heisenberg and was shown around the nuclear research facility, which used to be here in a Berlin suburb. The scientists called it the virus house to deter the curious.
Dr. Engel, this is the foundation on which the virus house stood originally?
Yes.
A critical moment. This was the chance for Heisenberg to get from Speer all the funding he needed for his bomb. Astonishingly, he asked for just enough money to build this small underground laboratory. Loose change at a time when the Americans were spending billions.
And now we are entering the reactor chamber.
Yes, this is the reactor chamber. And in the middle of the room, here was a reactor. And it was a modern laboratory for nuclear experiments.
I see.
Here.
Speer says, I asked Heisenberg at dinner that night how much money he wanted. And he answered a few 100,000 Reichsmarks, or whatever it happens to be. And Speer said, I was astounded at this small request.
Speer now put Heisenberg on the spot.
They asked Heisenberg, can you make an atomic bomb in 9 months? And Heisenberg said no, with the best of conscience. Nobody could do it in 9 months.
For Hitler, it was the last straw. He had always had a layman's disdain for nuclear physics, regarding it as incomprehensible and a Jewish science. So when the young, pushy Werner von Braun showed the Führer film of his latest rocket, Hitler became an instant convert. The money went into the V2. The atom bomb was forgotten. Was this conclusive proof that Heisenberg, the good German, had denied Hitler the one thing that would have won Germany the war?
Niemand hat die Bombe gewollt.
Nobody of the people who worked on it wanted the bomb. Everybody saw that now that you could do it, someone would. Because you will always find someone who's willing to do it.
But why did they stop? The real story is very different. Thanks to an extraordinary piece of British intelligence, we can tell exactly why the Germans never did build a bomb. This is Farm Hall, a country house near Cambridge. In 1945, the Allies captured Germany's top nuclear scientists, including Heisenberg, and interned them here. British intelligence wanted to know what they'd been up to, what secrets they were hiding. Unbeknownst to the Germans, all their conversations were recorded by hidden microphones.
And in the transcripts, we have the core of the matter. We have the scientists' discussions minute by minute and day by day of what they understood to be the technical possibilities for a bomb. We have them go through again the path that they followed from 1939 onwards, why they took the decisions they did, what they understood, what they didn't understand. and how they saw their project during the war in comparison to the Allies.
The most revealing section of the Farm Hall transcripts begins on August the 6th, 1945, with a British officer summoning Otto Hahn, the man who had discovered fission 6 years earlier, to tell him of an extraordinary announcement on the BBC.
Here is the news. President Truman has announced tremendous achievements by Allied scientists. They have produced the atomic bomb. One has already been dropped on a Japanese army base. At home, it has been a bank holiday of thunderstorms as well as sunshine. A record crowd of lords has seen Australia.
The temperature at the bomb's center was greater than the sun's. The flesh on all living creatures within half a mile was seared to a bundle of black char. Their internal organs evaporated. Further away, people were torn apart by the shock wave. The skin peeled off those up to 2 miles away. The intense radiation continued killing for months. 140,000 people died at Hiroshima, confirming the hopes and fears of the American scientists. So how did Heisenberg, the man who allegedly had known since 1940 how to build a bomb and had refused for moral reasons, how did he respond?
Heisenberg's first reaction is the most telling moment, I think, in the whole set of transcripts that we have, the whole 200 and some pages of English translation and summary of what the Germans said. And Heisenberg's first reaction is that it's impossible. The news story must be a mistake.
Did they use the word uranium in connection with this atomic bomb?
Nine.
Then it's got nothing to do with atoms, but the equivalent of 20,000 tons of high explosive. All I can suggest is that some dilettante in America who knows very little about it has bluffed them in saying, if you drop this, it has the equivalent of 20,000 tons of high explosive, and in reality, it doesn't work at all.
At any rate, Heisenberg, you're just second-raters, and you might as well pack up.
I still don't believe a word about the bomb. I consider it perfectly possible that they have about 10 tons of enriched uranium.
For several minutes, Heisenberg rants on, refusing to believe that anyone can build an atomic bomb. Not the demeanor of a man who knows how to, but who has not deigned to.
Their speculations range over an enormous variety of practical and completely impractical ideas, all jumbled together. Reactors, bombs with moderator, bombs like reactors, bombs made from protoactinium, bombs made from ionium, bombs made from thorium, bombs made with all kinds of exotic designs. They go through one after another to try and guess how the Allies can have done what they've decided can't realistically be done.
Late on the night of Hiroshima, Otto Hahn, who is not a physicist himself, turns to Heisenberg and puts him on the spot. He asks him to explain how a bomb works.
How does the bomb explode?
In the case of the bomb, it can only be done with very fast neutrons. The fast neutrons in 235...
It's at this point that the whole myth of the Nobel scientist crumbles. The story that Heisenberg denied Hitler the bomb only stands if he knows how to build a bomb. But the more he goes on, the more evident it becomes that he doesn't. The whole thing hinges upon the calculation of critical mass, the amount of U-235 you need to get a chain reaction going.
So there's a fission at the start. Each time there's a fission, you get 2 new neutrons, but I'm only going to draw one. It reaches another uranium nucleus.
In a chain reaction, one neutron first of all splits one atom, which releases 2 neutrons, which split 2 more atoms, and so on, doubling the amount each time. Heisenberg worked out that in 80 such steps you would split 1 million billion billion atoms in a flash, and release enough energy to destroy an entire city. He then used a simple formula to work out how much uranium this would take.
So here he takes the length of each step, 6 centimeters, and the number of steps is 80. The square root of 80 is roughly 9. So Heisenberg concludes that the critical radius to get an explosion is 9 times 6 centimeters, which is 54 centimeters. And that corresponds to a mass of uranium of 13 tons. It's an elegant calculation. It's an appealing calculation. And though it looks delightfully clear and simple at first sight, it's conceptually completely wrong.
Heisenberg's mistake was to believe that every neutron had to split an atom. In fact, it didn't matter if a lot of them missed their mark. The chain reaction would still keep going. But this simple miscalculation cost Germany the war.
This is the amount of uranium that Frisch and Peierls in March 1940 estimated would be needed for an atomic bomb, about 1 kilogram, an amount they said in their report to the British government that could probably be isolated in about a year with a large but not unachievable industrial investment. This was, if any one point in the project, was the moment at which a bomb began to seem a feasible, not just a theoretically possible prospect. And this is the amount of uranium that Werner Heisenberg calculated would be needed for a bomb at Farm Hall in August of 1945, presumably the estimate he carried throughout the war, 13,000 kilograms of uranium-235. At the height of production of the Allied project at the end of World War II, the output of the isotope separation plant at Oak Ridge was perhaps several hundred grams a day, an amount that could produce a bomb like this every few days, an amount that would produce this much in about 150 years.
Well, this was a crucial mistake as a first step. It made it really physically impossible for them ever to make a good case that they are really on the track of an atomic bomb project. I believe the young people there knew it.
But no one's going to contradict him. He's the great professor. And you contradict a man like that at your risk, especially Heisenberg. And here we have to look at the personality. I mean, he's jovial. I mean, you talk to people who know, met Heisenberg, very jovial, very friendly and outgoing during his trips around the place. But you get on the wrong side, you contradict a man like that, and he has a very violent temper underneath. You know, you beat him at table tennis and he comes out at you.
At Farm Hall, the German physicists realized that Heisenberg had got it dreadfully wrong. It was left to Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker to come up with a faith-saving explanation for his failure.
I believe the reason we didn't do it was because all the scientists didn't want to do it on principle. If we had all wanted Germany to win the war, we would have succeeded.
And so the story of the moral resistance of the German physicists was born, still debated in books and plays 60 years later.
There is this fanciful fairy tale now that psychologically Heisenberg prevented himself from making such a calculation in order to sabotage the project, which is completely un-German. You would not want to do that.
If we had had the capacity to build the bomb, we would have done so, but we didn't have it. The real question would have been, if we had had the capacity of building a bomb, would we have done it? Thank God we never had to ask ourselves this question. Never.
After 6 months at Farm Hall, Heisenberg and the others were allowed to return to Germany. Heisenberg could never face the fact that he had simply got his sums wrong. Equally, he never made any claims for his own moral courage.
Ich glaube, mein Vater war kein Held. he was not a hero. Oder wenigstens.
Or at least, he did not see himself as a hero, and he was a very self-critical person. And I think this is why he said that he had been very lucky never to have been confronted with the choice of being a hero or dying, because he wasn't at all sure that he would have behaved like a hero. That's how he felt about it, I think.
I don't think the betrayal was to have worked on an atom bomb for Hitler. It was to have worked on an atom bomb for Hitler. It's whether one should only do physics or whether one should do physics and be a human being at the same time. And that's what he should have done.
Perhaps it's hard for us to let go of the idea that great scientists are morally wiser than the rest of us. But Werner Heisenberg, the good German, did not resist Hitler. It was his faulty calculations, not his moral courage, that spared us the Nazi bomb.